Clause 16 of PAM contract deal with partial possessions by employer. There are 3 sub-clauses, and within each sub-clauses there are sub-components. For full statement, you may refer to the PAM contract 2018. The relevant informations are summarized in these slides. First, we talk about partial possessions. This means that taking over the project partially from the contractor. It is either the employer need the building structures earlier than the completion date. The employer can request to possess the completed part before the entire project is completed, or probably due to the delay of the contractor that the contractor cannot deliver the work on time and the employer will need the building or structure. With that, the employer can request to possess those which are completed. Let us talk about the first case, which happened before the practical completions of the entire project, and the employer would like to possess the work that has already been done, while the rest will be leave it to the contractor to proceed with the work. Under these circumstances, the possessions is with the consent of the contractor, which is under this possessions of occupied place with consent. As the date of completions as agreed within the contract has yet to achieve, the employer will need the consent from the contractor to possess the completed part of the work, provided that imposing no interference or disturbance to the progressions of the work by the contractor. I believe the contractors have the right not to give consent to the employer, that even the employer is urgent about taking over certain completed part, as this may lead to the problem like disturbance of the work progress, or probably the issues related to the health and safety. The employer may not be able to possess the work. Let's say now we are referring to a case where part of the work can be handed over to the employer, and now the contractors give the consent to the employer for taking over of those parts. With that, the certificate of practical completions of the relevant part will need to be issued. You will need this CPC for the employer to occupy the relevant part of the work. Without CPC, the occupations of the employer will be illegal. This CPC will need to be issued within 14 days of the date of the possessions. And this CPC is not meant for the entire structure. It should be clearly specified the approximate total value of the occupied part. And the date of the certificate of practical completions will be the date of possessions. You know that for the work which has not been completed, is not entitled for the certificate of practical completions. You cannot simply create this certificate of practical completions for any works that has not been done or has not been completed. And this CPC only covers the occupied part by the employer. Let us look at this. We can classify the works into 3 main categories. The first one is the work that has not been completed. Second one, the work has been completed but not handed over to the employer yet. And the third one, it will be the completed work which has been handed over to the employer. The one that we are talking about here, it will be for the work which has been completed and handed over to the employer. This will be the part covered by the CPC stated here. For the works not completed, theoretically there shouldn't be any CPC. For the completed work but not being processed by the employer, you don't need the CPC as well. Practically, you will need to wait for all the pending works to be completed so that the CPC is issued at one go. You need to know that this CPC is theoretically for the entire project. Now we have a special case here, which the employer would like to process the structures slightly early than what it is stated in the contract. Then we come to this arrangement. Because the relevant part has been handed over to the employer, that has been under the possessions of the employer, that means the liquidated damage which are supposed to be imposed onto the contractor should be reduced. What is this liquidated damage? It is referring to the penalties to the non-completions. The main purpose of this liquidated damage is to protect the employer from the contractor who are unable to complete the work. Now the relevant part has already been completed and handed over to the employer for possessions. This shall not be applied to the contractor. With that, you will need to reduce the liquidated damage imposed onto the contractor by the ratio of the estimated value of the occupied part to the contract sum. For example, within the contract, it was agreed a certain amount of this liquidated damage. Now let's say the employer is possessing half of the work before the practical completions of the entire work. CPC will be issued within 14 days of the dates of possessions. It is clearly specified the value of the occupied part, which is half of the contract sum, and this liquidated damage will also be reduced by half. Whichever being completed shall not be subjected to liquidated damage. Similar principles applied to the retention fund. What is this retention fund? It is meant as a safeguard for any defective or non-conforming work by the contractor. There will be a certain amount of payment being retained by the employer during the payment to the contractor. In the case that the works are defective, the contractor will need to rectify those. If the contractor chooses not to rectify it, the employer may hire other people to do the rectification job, and this is going to be offset from this retention fund. Now that the relevant part has already been handed over to the employer, the amount of fund to be retained shall be reduced by the relevant ratio as per the estimated value of the occupied part versus the contract sum. However, the employer cannot fully release the retention fund, as those retention funds being released should reflect the portions of the occupied part, and within these fractions of the retention fund, half of the amount will be released within the period of honouring certificates. That means by the next payment to the contractor, this retention fund should be released to the contractor in accordance to the portions being occupied divided by the half. The remaining amount should be released within 14 days after making goods of all defects of the occupied part. As there could be some defects for the occupied part which the contractor will need to rectify, that half of the retention fund not being released to the contractor is meant to cover the making good of those defects. If the contractor is good enough to rectify all the defects, the rest of the retention fund in the ratio of the occupied part to the contract sum shall be fully released within 14 days. Next, we talk about the second scenario, which there is a delay of the work by the contractor and the employer has the right to possess the work, and the possessions by the employer will be on the completed part. Those which are not completed, it is either the extension of time is given to the contractor or there shall be penalties to the contractor in terms of the liquidated damage. Now the employer will need to possess the completed work, and this will be considered the possessions of the occupied part without consent. First, the employer will need the certificate of non-completions issued by the architect, stating that the project has already due, but there are works not being completed by the contractor, and the employer would like to possess the part of the project that has been completed, while the remaining the contractor will need to deliver them after completions. This is provided that the possessions of the occupied part cause no unreasonable disturbance to the progress of the contractor of the remaining works. That means that the employer can possess the completed part, as this is the right of the employer. However, the possessions cannot lead to unreasonable disturbance to the work progress of the remaining works. And for the occupied part, the contractor will need to remove all his site facilities, construction plants or equipments, materials and goods from the occupied parts. The architect should issue written instructions asking the contractor to remove those. This is about the content of clause 16 regarding partial possessions of the employer. This normally happens when the entire work is not fully completed and the employer will need to possess part of the work which has already been completed. If you find this to be confusing, as it involves two main cases, one is possessions with consent and without consent, probably we can look into the flow chart here for better understanding. Let us first look at the normal progressions of the work. First, there will be commencement of the work. The contractor is doing the construction work until the entire work has been completed, and there will be certificate of practical completions. And after the certificate of practical completions, the entire project is being handed over back to the employer, and the employer may possess the work entirely. This is the normal route of a project. Now the scenario is the works are not fully completed, and the employer will need to possess those works which are completed, leaving the remaining to be continued by the contractor. This shall involve partial possessing of the work. When we talk about partial possessing of the work, we will need to check whether the work has been delayed or not, as this will govern whether the possession is with consent or without the consent of the contractor. Let's say now we first look at the possessions of occupied parts with consent. That means the works are not delayed. The employer would like to possess the work earlier than the completion date. This will require the consent of the contractor. If the contractor does not allow that, the employer should theoretically not entitled or not allowed to possess the completed part. Now, if the contractor allowed for the completed part to be possessed by the employer, the architect will need to issue the certificate of practical completions within 14 days of the dates of possessions. The date of this certificate of practical completions, it will be the date of the possessions. And this certificate of practical completions should clearly specify the approximate value of the occupied part. It should not cover the uncompleted part. With this certificate of practical completion issued, due to the possessions of the completed part by the employer, the liquidated damage shall not be relevant on the completed parts. The purpose of the liquidated damage is to protect the employer from the contractor who are unable to complete the work. Therefore, this liquidated damage shall be reduced by the ratio of the estimated value of the occupied part. The same principle applies to the retention fund, which is also based on the estimated value of the occupied part by the ratio to the contract sum, and 50% of it will be released to the contractor. And the contractors are to remove all the equipment from the occupied part. Theoretically, this should happen together upon the possessions of some part of the work by the employer. Once the certificate of practical completion is issued, that means the part occupied by the employer will be under the defect liability period. Within the period of this LDP, should there any damage or defect found by the employer, architect will need to list them in the schedules of defect sent to the contractor. The contractor will need to rectify that. And after the contractor make goods of those defects, the remaining 50% of this retention fund will be released to the contractor. This is about the part of the possessions with the contractor's consent. When the employer would like to possess the wood before the actual completion date. Let's say now the wood is delayed. The contractor is supposed to deliver the entire project to the employer. Now the contractor cannot fully deliver. The employer would like to possess the completed part, as there could be some arrangement or planning of the employer which cannot allow for the delay of the possessions of the site. To minimize the damage to the employer, the completed part can be handed over to the employer, provided that there is no unreasonable disturbance to the contractor. So this will be under the category of possessions without the contractor's consent. Because the work has been delayed, there will be certificate of non-completion issued, and the employer may possess the site without the contractor's consent, but the employer cannot impose any disturbance to the contractor for the remaining works, and the contractor will need to remove all the equipment from the occupied part. This is regardless whether the contractor likes it or not like it.